Reincarnation. The idea that we return to another body after the death of our current body has fascinated humanity since the beginning of time. It raises arresting questions. The phenomenon of people dying and returning to life to tell their tales in the afterlife has been a recurring theme in the ancient literature of many cultures, from the Greeks to the Etruscans to the Old Norse. But how do we perceive incidents of near-death experiences today? According to a recent study, around 15 million Americans have had a near-death experience. 3.3 million Germans have had a near-death experience. 2 million cases have been acknowledged in France. With similar statistical figures around the world, a growing body of evidence suggests that this widespread phenomenon should not be dismissed as merely myth or legend.
He regained consciousness, and we as a resuscitation team, and I was attending doctor, we were very, very happy. The patient was extremely disappointed. And he told me about a tunnel and a light and the beautiful colors, a beautiful landscape. And I never forgot this event, but I never didn't do anything with it.
In the years that followed, Dr. Lommel worked at the Rheinstadt Hospital, Arnhem, where he was confronted with death almost every day. Although he had never forgotten the 1969 experience, he didn't do anything about it. But this changed in 1986, after he read a book about near-death experience by George Ritchie called Return from Tomorrow.
And that was the moment that my scientific curiosity started to grow, because according to our current medical knowledge, it is not possible to experience consciousness, let alone enhance consciousness, when you have a cardiac arrest, when you're unconscious because there is no breathing, no heartbeat, no blood pressure. So that was the reason that we started with some other scientists a prospective study in the Netherlands. We had 344 consecutive patients who survived cardiac arrest in 10 Dutch hospitals. We had a first interview within several days of resuscitation, as soon as they were more able to respond to our questions. And we found that 18% of those patients who survived cardiac arrest had memories of a period of unconsciousness, who had a near-death experience. We did the prospective study and the longitudinal study in the Netherlands in 10 Dutch hospitals, which took 10 years. no funding at all, just volunteers, because there was no institution who would pay any penny for such studies. When it was published in The Lancet, it was a worldwide boost. It was incredible. It was on the front pages of all papers, Indian Times, Frankfurter Allgemeine, Le Figaro, Le Monde, in the United States, everywhere it was mentioned. Not always well quoted. There were some papers that said the scientists proved the soul, which we didn't. But it's always a problem with journalists, they don't quote well. But mostly, but it is in the scientific world, it was more accepted. Near-death experience is still a huge taboo, but it's going better. But also death is a huge taboo in our Western world.
And that her organs had now begun to shut down.
I met with Anita's doctor later that evening when he came in. And at that time he said to me that Anita's probably not going to make it through the night. And he went off and continued his rounds. And he said he'd come back and see me in the morning. He really didn't expect Anita to be there in the morning. But as Anita lay there through the evening, I made it an absolute point. The nurses weren't doing this, but I made it an absolute point of to stay awake and to watch the three things that I knew to watch. And one was her oxygen uptake, and one was to watch was her blood pressure, and one to watch was her pulse. So I spent the entire evening just watching these three dials.
As the night progressed, the oxygen saturation dropped to decisively dangerous levels. Anita was now slipping away, and Danny just sat there watching her die. Even as Anita lay there, literally on her deathbed, in some ways, she was more alive than ever. It is usually in just such life-threatening situations that a person experiences an NDE.
I joined the Air Force in '91, and I went into the fighter stream. I flew MiG-21s, then I flew MiG-27s, and I flew them for about 8 years till I had my accident.
Atul, a fighter pilot in the Sea Flying Squadron of the Indian Air Force, had an NDE when, during a routine sortie, his combat jet spun out of control due to technical failure, and he was forced to eject out of the plane. No amount of training that he had gone through prepared him for the real experience.
There are a lot of checks and balances, and a lot of effort goes into ensuring that you are prepared or you have logically thought through everything that can go wrong, including the experience of dropping us from an helicopter into a lake, so that you know you have gone through almost everything. But it's a logical and it's a mind-interpreted thing. It is not an experience. The experience of an air accident or an experience of something is something that you live through. It's just that you have prepared for it, but you are experiencing it first time.
On the 8th of September 1998, Atul was not supposed to fly. He was called in to replace a sick pilot. Reluctantly, Atul agreed to carry out the routine sortie that he had done a number of times before.
I was supposed to drop a bomb on a range. Generally in the Air Force you have these ranges where you go practice bombing, so that case of an eventuality, in case you're going into war, you have practiced how to drop a bomb. So that is what I was supposed to do that day. There was nothing out of the blue, or it was just a normal routine sortie that I would have done so many times before in my life. It was just you go over a range, standard procedures are there. I had one more person. Fighter aircraft tend to fly in groups, so we were two of us together. I was the lead for that mission, and we were supposed to drop our bombs and come back and land. I went, flew in, I rolled into the dive. Everything was beautiful. You had to drop at a certain height. So I said, okay, the height was coming. I pressed the trigger and I pulled out. And just as I was coming to the horizon, the aircraft yawed. A fighter class of aircraft doesn't yaw, especially at those speeds. And that's where everything kind of changed, because we have onboard computers, and the yaw lasted 125 milliseconds. But I remember my legs moving, trying to counter the yaw with the rudder. And even today, so many years down the line, I remember vividly that moment of yaw. I can see it. And then the aircraft flicked and went into a spin.
Right at that point, Atul left his body, and from a point outside, he perceived his body ejecting out of the plane. He remembers vividly that he did not take the decision to pull the ejection lever.
I do not have any conscious memory of taking the decision to eject. Now, as a pilot, you're trained to eject. So you know that sometime you have to take the decision to eject, and you're supposed to tighten your straps so that the ejection is also safe. So there has to be a process where you decide, yes, now things are out of control, I need to get out of this aircraft. My memory is pretty sharp because I remember the 125 milliseconds, but I don't remember taking the decision to eject. I always wonder, if I didn't, then who? So this is a paradox that I have not been able to resolve. I have not been found a solution to.
In both their individual NDEs, Anita and Atul experienced a feeling of peace and fearlessness.
The fear was completely gone. I had lived my life in fear, and especially those 4 years of dealing with cancer. It was like every morning I used to wake up and all I felt was this fear of how am I going to get rid of this cancer in my body. But now in this realm, it was like the fear was just gone.
Everything was calm, there was no noise. There was peace at a level.
In her NDE, she heard a conversation between her doctor and her husband, in which the doctor was extremely negative in his prognosis of her condition. She saw her younger brother sitting in a plane on his way to meet her, a fact that she was not aware of when she slipped into her coma. Events that were beyond her ability to know.
I was aware of everything that was happening around me. I was aware of things that were even being said outside the room of where I was. I also became aware that my brother was on a flight, on a plane from India trying to get to me. And I was aware that he wanted to get to me before I was dying. And I clearly remember feeling that I need to stay alive.
In their NDEs, both Anita and even Atul became aware of another reality, contrary to the physical one that we know.
It was just so blissful and so peaceful. And I felt this incredible lightness, just very, very light. And the pain was gone. And I just never felt so beautiful before. I just never recall ever feeling that. And also the love that I felt. For the first time, I felt like I was loved just unconditionally, just because I existed.
It was really beautiful. It was one of the most beautiful sights I've seen in my life. And I could see my aircraft spinning like an autumn leaf. It was really beautiful. Everything was calm. There was no noise. There was peace at a level. And I could just see the aircraft fall like autumn leaf, and then it dropped and it burst into flames.
The patient with a positive near-death experience have a frightening period when they are in a dark room.
To their horror, they sometimes find themselves pulled deeper into darkness. The experience is devoid of positive emotions and later stirs profound feelings of guilt.
It's dark, it's frightening, and then they see the small light, they're attracted to it, and they describe it as a tunnel. But perhaps only 1 or 2% of those people go down in this dark room, and they have experiences like what is written by Dante in hell. Divina Commedia, Divine Comedy. And he must have had an NDE as well, Dante, because he can describe exactly what people can perceive in this hellish environment. When they come back, they are feeling guilt that they were there because of Christianity, because of the church.
Terrifying NDEs may produce long-lasting emotional trauma, but coming to terms with this experience may eventually bring a positive change. An important element of the NDE is the out-of-body experience, or OBE. The OBE begins with the patient's sensation of consciousness leaving the physical body, accompanied by some fear, and followed by an attempt to return to the body. They often feel liberated and amazed at the sight of their lifeless or seriously damaged body. The most common vantage point is from the ceiling, and because of this unusual position, some people initially fail to recognize their body. They experience their new weightless body as a spiritual or non-physical body that can penetrate solid structures. It is impossible for them to communicate or touch others who are present. To their utter amazement, they go unnoticed, even though they can see and hear everything. OBE is of scientific importance because doctors, nursing staff, and relatives can verify the reported events as narrated by the experiencer.
One of the most famous cases is also from our study. Well, the 44-year-old man who was found in a meadow by some passers-by, and they didn't really start resuscitation. They did some pressing before the ambulance came.
After admission to the coronary unit, he received artificial respiration with a balloon and a mask, as well as heart massage and defibrillation. While intubating the patient, the nurse discovered that the patient was wearing dentures in his mouth. The nurse removed the upper denture and put them on a crash cart. After approximately 90 minutes, the patient had sufficient heart rhythm and blood pressure, but he was still in a deep coma.
He was in coma for 1 week. Then he regained consciousness and was transferred back to the cardiac ward. He was just there. Then the nurse came in for medication, and he saw the nurse and said, "You were the one who took out my dentures. You know where my dentures are." And he couldn't explain exactly what had happened. He couldn't explain the small room where he had been resuscitated. He came in coma without any breathing, without any blood pressure. Deep coma. He couldn't describe the appearances like the doctors and the nurses, also the nurse who were there. And he said he had seen everything from a position out and above his body. He could describe details were impossible to see from the position where he was lying. And he was very impressed with it. The nurse was impressed as well, because the nurse knew that this all happened when this patient was in deep coma and in the course of resuscitation. So that's another proof that you don't see with your eyes at this very moment, because you're not in your body.
Interestingly, among the reported cases of NDEs, there are numerous cases of blind people seeing and deaf people hearing.
People that are blind, include even those born totally blind, have described highly visual near-death experiences. I interviewed a lady named Vicky who was born totally blind.
In 1951, Vicky was born extremely prematurely, after a pregnancy of only 22 weeks. She was immediately placed in a very primitive incubator and administered 100% oxygen. Such a high concentration of oxygen led to complete damage of her eyeball and optic nerve. She was hurled out of her car in a traffic accident in 1973 and suffered multiple fractures to her basal skull and severe concussions, which left her in a coma. That is when she experienced an NDE.
When you're born totally blind, vision is unknown and unknowable. You simply cannot explain vision to somebody born totally blind in terms of the remaining 4 senses. It's impossible. Vicky had a bad auto accident when she was in her early 20s, and the first time in her life that she saw herself was when she had a near-death experience in the hospital emergency room.
In the emergency room, she was able to see from a position above her body.
There above her body, She was immediately horrified. Vision was new and unfamiliar, and something she simply had no prior life experience with. But only when she calmed down did she become aware that that body down below her was her. She was able to correlate the feel of her long hair, and interestingly, the feel of a ring that her father had given her, which he'd only known during her whole prior life by a sense of feel. Now, she was able to see it with vision and understand indeed that was her down below, and that was the beginning of her very detailed, and if you will, typical near-death experience.
With our current concepts, you cannot explain near-death experiences, so we have to change our concepts. And I think that was the challenge based on this scientific prospective studies on near-death experience, to discuss again how consciousness is related.
I became aware of my father who had died 10 years prior to this experience. And it was like he was there to greet me. I had lost my best friend. She was like a sister to me. I had lost her 2 years prior to cancer. I encountered her in the other realm. And again, all I felt from her was absolute unconditional love. And I had missed her so much in these last 2 years.
Finally, Anita reached a point in this other reality where she had to make a choice whether to return to her physical body or continue on in that realm.
I really didn't want to come back. I just didn't want to come back because it was so incredible on the other side. And my body was so sick. I couldn't see any good reason to come back. Not only was I suffering in that body, but even my family was suffering.
In a moment of clarity, Anita understood that if she were to make the decision to come back to her physical body, then the body would heal itself of the cancer.
Now that I knew what I knew, that if I chose to go back into my body would just heal. The cancer would heal very quickly. I just knew that.
People often see part of their life that is yet to come.
Sometimes a flash forward is a preview of someone's life. Then they come to a border, and they know at that moment that if I cross this border, I will never come back, and then they hear a voice, or they're instructed, you have to go back, there's not a task to fulfill, and then they can come consciously back into their body, which is awful for them because you're back in this sick body, again with all the limitations.
Anita's realization that her decision to go back to her physical body would cause it to self-heal came true. She came back and surprised everyone.
As I started to open my eyes, one of the first people I saw was my brother. He had arrived in Hong Kong and his suitcase was right behind him. He'd come to the hospital straight from the airport. And I smiled at him, and in fact, my family then gathered around me, my husband, my mom, and they were all smiling because they were really surprised that I was coming out of the coma. They were actually quite thrilled.
In comparison, Atul's NDE was a short one. He came back to his body even before his parachute touched down.
And then I started descending with the parachute, and I said, now I'm going to go into the fire. And I said, no, what do I do with this? Suddenly, I don't know from where, one gust of wind came, and I kind of landed about 100 meters away from the aircraft. And I ran, because the aircraft was exploding. I was very close to it. So I ran for about 100, 150 meters, and I hid behind some boulders. The helicopter came, They picked me up. I walked about 200 meters, 300 meters till there, and I lay down. After that, for 7 days, I just couldn't get up.
Whatever the duration of an NDE, in both cases, time seems to have lost its meaning.
Time is so strange in the other realm. It was almost like within that instant that I had actually decided I didn't want to come back, it was like I entered another state, which was a state of incredible clarity. And in that moment, I felt as though I understood everything. I understood why my life was the way it was. I understood how every decision that I had made in every moment in time of my life had led up to that point of me dying on that hospital bed.
Time had almost stood still. So that was the kind of feeling, or that's the kind of memory that I have. And these memories are really vivid, and I can still recollect them.
Over the next few days, Anita's story started to come out as she started talking about her experience. Although still very sick physically, Anita felt euphoric after her NDE.
When the doctor came in about 3 or 4 days later, and he felt that the tumors had gone down by about 70%, he was really, really like in total shock and surprise. He didn't even know what to write in my medical records, and he actually said that. He said, your case is amazing. I don't even know what to put in your medical records. And it was almost as though he made the gesture that he wanted to throw my records into the bin, as though he doesn't even know how to move forward from here. So he thought the best thing to do now was to just keep running more tests to see where my body was at in terms of the cancer.
I think what's also remarkable about Anita and her incredible healing following her near-death experience is that we've seen other people that have had near-death experiences that had astounding and from time to time, in my opinion, medically inexplainable healing. It really makes you wonder about some of these things that go on in near-death experiences. In fact, sometimes people are aware during their near-death experience that they're going to come back healed or will recover rapidly, and almost invariably that's actually what happens.
Atul's recovery played out a little differently, but with an amazingly similar conclusion. At first, his injuries were not apparent, but as they started to surface over a span of almost 2 years, the doctors declared that he would live a highly handicapped life and that he would be unable ever to lift more than 2 kilos of weight.
So at the end of 2 years, they knew exactly what all was wrong. I had a lot of L1, L2, L3, L4, L5, had problems there. I had some problem in D1, D2, I had a burst fracture, I had some damage in the disc. I had about 3 discs were damaged between L1 and L5, I don't remember now where. And that said that I can't lift more than 2 kgs of weight, and they said my life will be downhill from there. So they said, we wish you luck. And they said, smile whatever happens. But thank God they said smile, because I smiled and everything changed. Today I can lift about 22 kgs.
In both cases, the doctors were astonished and refused to acknowledge something that medical science could not explain.
There are some skeptical arguments that basically say what they saw when they had an out-of-body experience was a lucky guess. They had that gap of unconsciousness, and then the memory just simply recreated what they thought would have happened. That would make sense if their out-of-body observations during a near-death experience were very often wrong or unreal, and you almost never see that. We've had people that have coded, if you will, in the operating room, had their consciousness leave their body and go to the hospital cafeteria where they can see and hear what their family members are talking about, where they're far away in the hospital, coded and under a general anesthesia. And yet, in that example, what the near-death experiencer saw and heard was later confirmed as absolutely accurate. That is impossible for that to be a fragment of memory or a lucky guess. And there are literally scores of near-death experiences all finding the same thing. Even if the out-of-body observations are far, far from the physical body, far from any possible sensory awareness, what they see and what they hear, when they go back to verify it later, is essentially always accurate, even down to the finest details.
It has also been alleged that NDEers tell deliberate lies to look interesting or to impress others.
Never met a person who tried to fraud me. Because the moment you see a person and try to find words for such an emotional experience, you know it's true. I've never met a person who tried to fraud me. Never. And that's enough. I think, why should someone try? I don't understand why should someone try to fraud me. So I never met a person who tried. It's just a theoretically approach by the skeptics.
I just knew I had to do it, so I did it. That's all. I will not say it is compassion, I would just say that you just think that everything is, what else is there to do? This is what you're here to do anyway. So it's that kind of a frame of mind.
Anita and Atul now continue to live their lives with the knowledge